I'm going to give you an overview of all of our research in this area, which has really been, I think, some of the first pioneering work that's been done in the area of persistent forms of higher states of consciousness. So you can call them sort of higher levels of consciousness if you want. I'm not a big fan, as you'll see, of things being higher or lower than other things. And you'll see that in how I do my modeling and how I talk about it and stuff like that. But you know, at the beginning, I always have to sort of orient you based around things that you've heard of before. And so everybody's heard of higher states or higher levels of consciousness. And that's essentially what we're going to be talking about today. Some of the first large-scale empirical data, really, that's ever been collected in this population. And I don't know why that is. I speculate that it's probably because they were hard to find up until fairly recently with enough internet penetration and stuff like that, and then maybe hard to get to before modern travel or whatever. And I don't think there's anything special about us per se, except that maybe we came along at the right time, and you know, the right historical forces had sort of come together, and we wound up being the ones who did this study. So we're going to use this term, which is persistent non-symbolic experience. This comes from Suzanne Cook-Greuter, a Cook-Greuter paper around 2000. She's a leading developmental psychologist, if you're not familiar with who she is. And she talked about non-symbolically mediated consciousness. Non-symbolic is a great word for us. You don't have to read too much into it, but it's a great word for us because it's the one that actually had us not get the door slammed in our face from our various potential participants. And so it turns out that this population is incredibly touchy about language. And lots of them don't like the word consciousness, but lots of them do like the word consciousness. And lots of them don't like the word experience, but lots of them do like the word experience. And there's no real way to tell, even from their books and websites and whatever else, like what it is they're going to like or not like. And so you would wind up, you know, talking to them and saying either consciousness or experience and having them say, I can tell right now you're never going to understand this. I'm sorry, I don't want to participate. Right? And so we needed basically some term that nobody had any idea what it meant, but that when they heard it, it sounded really good. It sort of fit their internal experience. And thankfully, Suzanne, after years of working in developmental psychology and in sort of the developmental psychology of these states, came up with a fantastic term. We tested a whole bunch of terms, and that's basically the one that won. So everybody always says, why non-symbolic experience? Why the word non-symbolic? So now you know. We'll just get that one off the table right away, because even like just, you know, the 5 minutes before this, right? People were like, non-symbolic. Why that word? So you can see what it's a catch-all phrase for, right? These are things that you've probably heard of before: enlightenment, non-duality, so on and so forth. One important thing about this is that, of course, it's not limited to spiritual or religious people. I think it's been fantastic that religion and spiritual systems have been a cultural carrier for this for a very, very long time. You know, empires rise and fall, but oftentimes religions and spiritual systems bleed across them. And so this hasn't really, knowledge of this was never really wiped out, thanks to the fact that those cultural carriers were able to go from one culture to the next as these things occurred. However, that, I think, has given it sort of this mistaken sense that it's about some sort of spiritual or religious type of experience exclusively. And in fact, we have tons of atheists, tons of agnostics that are in our research population, both our first and second phase study. These are the terms that I'm going to be using tonight. So I started using PNSE back during my dissertation a long time ago now, and that basically meant you had this experience persistently. So if you were Buddhist or whatever, you might have said that you were enlightened consistently for more than a year at that point. Of course, oftentimes people had been in these various states of consciousness, or traits of consciousness, as we might think of them from a psychology standpoint, for decades. But you had to be in it for at least a year. We had to have some sort of minimum qualifying criteria. The downside for that came later when we started to be able to put people into these things, because we'd already made our main term a year or later. And so we couldn't really go back and say, okay, now it's not a year or later, now that term means that you've been in it for 36 seconds or whatever, right? So we had to keep PNSE, and we created a second term, and that's what ongoing non-symbolic experience is for. Basically, it's persistent and it's ongoing, but somebody hasn't hit the 1 year mark. So all the data that I'll be presenting today from the second phase of our study, it's all ongoing non-symbolic experience, because it's data that we took right after they got out of the right after they got out of the experiment. And then if you've had some sort of temporary glimpse of it, and I don't care if this is, 3 nanoseconds of experience with non-symbolic experience, or if you were in what seemed like a persistent form of non-symbolic experience for 20 years and then got knocked out of it. Either way, we classify you as having had temporary non-symbolic experience. All right? So everybody falls into one of these 3 categories, or a 4th one, which is no non-symbolic experience, or no or NSE. Let's see here. All right. So this is our first study, and basically I'm just going to let you read that. Basically, we just went around and we talked to an awful lot of people. We sent lots of people surveys. We did physiological measurement on people. Somebody up here on the Stanford panel was talking about like a 6-hour interview or something like that, or whatever it was. Our interviews were usually like 6 to 12 hours when we were doing them in this period. I used to not jokingly say that you have to throw me out of your living room to get me to stop collecting data on you. And oftentimes that's exactly what people would do. They'd be like, okay, listen, this has been fun, but I need to sleep now, so you have to leave my house. And then that would be that. That would be the end of the interview. Or every restaurant in town would be closed, and then we'd be like standing in the, the parking lot of the last coffee shop that had closed, and then the police would come by and say, listen, you have to move on. And that would be the end of the interview. I mean, no kidding. I would literally just latch onto these people with both arms and try to mine as much data as I possibly could out of them. And when you go to a conference like SAN that has a bunch of our research subjects, some of whom talk about participation, they'll actually joke about that. It's like an open joke that I was like the guy they couldn't get rid of. So let me talk a little bit about what we learned from that first part of the study. And what we basically got was sort of our arms around what this phenomenon was in the first place. When I started this, I was looking for the happiest people on Earth. I wanted to study the happiest people on Earth, and I wanted to see if I could become one of them. It was an incredibly selfish endeavor. Fortunately, one that worked out pretty well. And I wound up settling on these folks, and now here we are talking about this, right? But I think it helps to have a definition of what it is that we're actually talking about. So the core thing, the thing at the absolute heart of persistent non-symbolic experience is on the slide right now. And it is this shift away from the fundamental way that humans experience life, which is really kind of with discontentment. Always sort of feeling like something is kind of not quite right. And sometimes I give whole talks about this, and we can go into the evolutionary biology and psychology of it and stuff like that. But I think most of us can agree that sort of the human race is ultimately kind of a discontented sort of race. That's, if you will, sort of problem number one. In the mid-90s, I was involved at sort of the heart of one of the world's first largest advertising conglomerate, really. And that's what we traded on, right? I mean, we basically depended upon that fact being true and us being able to use that in order to sell people all kinds of stuff that they didn't need for temporary relief of that discontentedness. Well, the main thing that PNSE solves, regardless of what version of it you have, is a transition away from that and into a sense of sort of fundamental okayness, if you will, a sense that things are fundamentally okay. Now, I'm not saying that if you get divorced and your spouse is leaving you and it's like, the person is being very mean to you, that you're having sort of rosy thoughts all the time. That depends on how deep you are in PNSE. But nonetheless, you can look down beneath whatever that experience is at the current moment to a place where you will find a sense that everything is fundamentally okay. So this fundamental sense of okayness or contentment is really the heart of all of this. There's a sense that goes along with that you don't really need to add anything to yourself. So it would be, in that sense, kind of the bane of modern advertising, who's constantly trying to get you to add things to yourself to take care of that sense of contentment. Also, there's a reduction in self-referential thought, which means thoughts about you. And you may have never thought about how many thoughts you have every day about you, but it's virtually all of your thoughts, right? It's so many of your thoughts that I would meet with people and they would say things like, all of my thoughts went away. And of course, their thoughts hadn't all gone away, because I was having a conversation with them, and I mean, it's just obvious, you know, we're having an exchange of ideas or whatever, or experience, and their thoughts are clearly there. But their mind was so quiet compared to what came before it, and it was because of a reduction in thoughts about them, in those self-referential thoughts, essentially. So there's a huge difference there. And that brings another really nice benefit, which is increasing or even total freedom from emotions and moods affecting your day and all of that. There's often a sense of the present moment. This is a cliche around things like enlightenment, of course. Everybody's heard this. It's, you know, even Eckhart Tolle's book, right? The Power of Now. Or, I mean, you see this sense everywhere, but it really is true. Your memories genuinely do arise much less. And in fact, people often think that they have impaired memory as a result of that, just because their memories aren't spontaneously arising anymore. And sometimes they do have impaired memory. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but most oftentimes they don't. The same with the future. That self-referential chatter is often what's, you know, calling the future to mind, and when it dies down, well, guess what? You're pretty much just here in this room for the most part. There's an increased sense of connectedness and possibility. Not a surprise, it goes along with all that, as well as sort of an overall sense of flow that kicks in. Here are some psychological correlates. And so you can see right down the center axis here are some things that relate to this. And so sense of self, degree of emotion, degree of self-thoughts, attachment to self-thoughts, degree of attachment in general, sense of agency. Agency is like the sense that you can do something in the world. Literally, no kidding, the actual feeling like I can do something in the world, like I can hold this up. That's a sense of agency. And then a degree of peace. And you can see what's in the direction of PNSE and what's in the direction of sort of a more normal state of consciousness around all of these things. And for the most part, they're all less, except for the degree of peace, which is more, and the sense of self, which at any location essentially feels expanded. Well, let's talk about some of the deeper patterns associated with this. Probably one of the things I'm most well known for is these locations. They're basically clusters of experience, and they just emerged from all of our data. I had no idea that they were in there for quite a while, and so they were not something that I was looking for. And I hadn't, people would give me their books and stuff, but I actually have an incredible library of books from all these people that we've interfaced with over the years, and I don't think I've even read one of them. And part of that is because I've really wanted to maintain a sense that we collect data from people who are alive, from their own lips, so that I can ask them questions back, so that I can make sure that I'm clear, that I'm understanding what they meant, right? I don't want to read it in a book. You know, if they wrote a book 10 years ago, that's probably not true for them today. That's probably not where they're at today. And so all of our data was really freshly collected from people who were alive. So if you ask me about historical figures, probably I won't have any opinion at all about a historical figure. In fact, I may have never even heard of them unless a research subject mentioned them or something. And so I really came to this as a pretty blank slate. And each one of these clusters I chose to call a location, and that was a deliberate sort of act against hierarchy. I don't like to think of things as stages or levels or anything like that, because I personally think that it's fine to be in any one of these. I'm not like your standard spiritual teacher who is always trying to convince you that further is better. No, you have to go further. You have to go further. I think further can be disastrous in many cases for people. And so I'm not a further is better kind of person. And as a result of that, I didn't want to leave an impression of levels or stages that one passed through or something like that. I wanted to give people permission to basically reside in any of these and have it be fine. Now, each one of these, like location 2, for instance, is, location 2 is huge. There's all kinds of sub-experiences in location 2 that sort of cluster to make the overall experience. But so, for instance, location 2 has a facet to it of something called non-duality, which literally sort of feels like everything is kind of one thing. There's many different kinds of non-duality, though, and some of them fit in location 2, some of them fit in location 4, some of them fit in later locations. And I think sometimes when you hear these terms in the public space where it's like, oh, such and such is non-dual, or this is non-duality, or whatever, it's such a smear. Those people really have no idea how different their experiences are, because they haven't sat down with each other for 12 hours like I sat down with each of them, right, for 12 hours to really sort of dig into this type of question. And so consequently, for something like a location 2 experience of non-duality, that leads quite a landscape landscape of different kinds of related forms of non-duality, but nonetheless that are kind of distinct and different from each other, and that can even sort of be passed through in sort of a stage-like way in some cases. So some people stay in one spot and others move around the continuum. It's becoming increasingly common to move now. When I started doing this 12 years ago, it was kind of rare for people to move. And so that's a fairly new phenomenon. I think probably a lot of that comes from our outreach. And generally speaking, people go forward, but as we'll see, that's not always the case. So let's talk about location 1 here. In location 1, essentially, you have this expanded sense of self. You really sort of don't feel like you're confined by your body in the same way that you did before it. Now, that doesn't mean that I feel like I bleed out into everything or anything poetic like that. It just feels like there's this sense that you're no longer sort of confined by your skin, like you really, really, really felt like you were before you had a transition to it. You also have, I'll just read from here. You can read from the screen up there. You're much less affected by those self-referential thoughts, but they're not gone. You still have plenty of self-referential thoughts at this stage. You still have plenty of positive and negative emotions, but you've got distance from them. You've got that sense of peace, that sense of fundamental okayness that we talked about, and you've started to privilege it big time. You've started to probably orient your life around making sure that you don't lose that fundamental sense of peace. And so people make all kinds of life changes as a result of that. There's a trust in sort of how things are. It comes from that fundamental sense of okayness. And you care a lot less about your own personal history, and your own personal story, and oftentimes about stories in general. All sorts of media consumption habits change and things like that. Sort of this notion of story. You might be very bored or disinterested with your friends all of a sudden, for instance, even friends that you've had for your entire life, and you'll notice a realignment around who you spend your time with and stuff like that. So location 2 just sort of continues in that direction. Self-referential thoughts continue to decline. Your positive and negative emotions, your negative emotions continue to fall off rapidly. They become increasingly positive over time. So as you move deeper from location 2 towards location 3, your emotional life is getting increasingly more positive. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it's entirely positive by the time you reach here, but it's really, it's a really, really sort of nice state to be in. This is a non-dual location, as I mentioned earlier. I don't have time to talk for 2 hours about non-duality alone. I'm sure many of you have heard that term and have some sense of what it is. Your interesting thing about location 2, and this is really, really hard when you're doing research, is that people in location 2 have a sense that there is a correct choice. They have agency, and there's a sense that there's a right thing to do. And so when you contact them and say, hey, would you like to participate in research? They have this sense, right, underneath, and they're like, no, or yes, right? And all too often, unfortunately, it's no, right? And they don't know why. They can't tell you why it's no. They'll often say things like, I think what you're doing is great. I've got all these people I can refer you to. It just doesn't feel right for me. And they can't really articulate why it doesn't feel right to them. It took us years to figure that out. We've learned that we can psychologically prime them like you can prime other people, and that sense of what's right and what's not right is ultimately psychologically primable, just as it is in the rest of the population, just as one does with advertising, for instance. There's higher well-being here than in location 1. In location 3, it's a real departure from what came before it, but it's also logical in many ways. So some things are just sort of continuing along the trajectory that we've already seen. Self-referential thoughts continue to decline. They're almost gone at this point, but not entirely. What changes is a huge difference in your emotional makeup. And instead of having a mix of positive or negative emotions, instead of having even a range of these emotions, you're basically left with an emotion. And it feels like it has 3 facets associated with it. So the first facet is love, and the second one is joy, and the third one is compassion. And there can be as many as 5 or 6 facets, depending upon cultural differences and stuff like that. But that is kind of an interesting change. It seems like from location 1 to 2, things are getting more positive, and then to 3, you're sort of left with what is in what feels like really the ultimate emotional life that a human can have. And so I have a slide, I don't have it in the deck today because of time, but where we ask people like all of these traits, you know, all of these like positive traits for how you can experience life. And if you hold them up against the locations, it's like, you know, location 1 has some, location 2 has some, and then location 3 has like almost all of them, and then location 4 has some. There's a sense in location 3 that it just can't possibly get any better to be human than this experience. Right? So it's the end of the Christian mystical path. It's the end of many paths of many traditions all around the world. And it's easy to understand because really, like I said, if I were to hold that slide up, you would see this curve where there would be this long list of amazing things that topped the experience list underneath location 3 and not under the other locations. So that's kind of interesting. Another interesting thing about this is that there's 2 different experiences. There's fundamentally 2 different flavors associated with this. You might have a divine version of this experience. Literally, it might feel like this is a dualistic experience again, incidentally. So you remember location 2 is non-dual, location 3 is dual again. Very subtly dual. There's a sense that you can sort of merge and increasingly merge with the divine for some people. Right? Obviously, if you're all one thing, you can't merge with something else. So there's this switch, basically, back to duality that some ancient traditions have picked up on, like John Hagelin, the TM leader in America. I was looking through his slides when we were having dinner one time, and he had similar levels broken out from the Vedas, which he had labeled, you know, dual, non-dual, dual, non-dual. And so it's always nice when you see sort of corroborating evidence like that. But not everyone has the divine version. So if you don't have the divine version, it might simply feel like sort of a panpsychic experience. If you're not familiar with that notion, it's the sense that sort of everything is conscious, or everything is consciousness, if you will. And so some people have a divine sense, some people have a panpsychic sense. Generally speaking, the well-being is higher than in location 2, and then in location 4, and this is just what people are reporting. Location 4 is like falling into another world. Location 4 is often described as feeling alien. Literally, people say, I feel like an alien. Like the last vestiges of my humanity, I feel like I left behind at location 3. So this is a big change for people, and you can see some of the things up here. No sense of emotion, right? No sense of agency, literally feeling like the world is just unfolding. You can tell you're taking all kinds of action, you're probably performing your work duties great, and you frankly have no idea how, because it just seems to all be naturally unfolding with you not having any sense of agency involved in the process. There's so many stories that I've heard from people who had a transition to location 4 before work, right, or in between work shifts, and they were thinking to themselves, how in the world am I going to go into work tomorrow or later today and get my job done? And then, you know, the day goes by and everything gets done, and they're driving home and they're thinking, how in the world did that happen? And why didn't anybody notice how completely different I am, right? Which is another thing that's kind of baffling about this. From the outside, unless someone was very depressed beforehand, from the outside, there's sometimes not a lot of change. If we have a little bit of time later, I can elaborate on that. So self-referential thought essentially completely gone at this point. It really lays your perceptual triggers bare. And so a good example of this that I like to tell is I was with a research subject at a major party school, it turned out, one of the big universities in America. And we were walking across the greens, the lawns, and it was like the first day when it was warm, and there were just beautiful co-eds lying everywhere in bikinis. And I knew that he was married. And so I figured he was heterosexual. And I said, hey, you know, are you noticing, you know, any of the, you know, stunningly beautiful women laying around in next to nothing as we're walking across these lawns? And he says, well, you know, occasionally my eyes will orient to one of them, but nothing arises. And that's a good way of thinking about the low level of perception that's operating at that point. So many different parts of the psyche that are constructed on top of that And I asked him, what do you make of that? He's like, well, I assume that there's, at a very low level of our nervous system, a orienting response for procreation, and that's sort of what I'm seeing when my eyes are drawn to something, but that all the stuff above it has basically just been deconstructed or wiped out by this process in some way, which I think is a really great way of saying that. So let's see. This one does have some memory issues. So if you pick your daughter up at school every day at 3, you're not going to forget your daughter. If you had a doctor's appointment at 3:30, you're probably going to forget the doctor's appointment. Right? That's a good example of what kind of memory has an issue. All right, so there's more than 4 locations, but people only land in the first 4. We haven't had anyone report directly transitioning to location 5 or later. We're not sure how many there are, but there's a lot of them. I almost never talk about location 5, but I'm going to do it tonight just to have sort of a more complete record. So after location 4, there's sort of a fork in the road. And people can really take one of 2 paths. One path continues to look a lot like location 4, and that path basically seems to go the furthest. Like, I don't think we've even come close to charting the end of that path. The other path is sort of like a return to humanity. So I call the first one the path of freedom, and it continues like location 4, and it really goes. The second one is sort of a return to humanity. It's a reconstitution of emotion. It's not emotion as it was socially constructed in sort of normal people, but there is a return to the experience of emotion in many ways. And so it's sort of like, people get to location 4 and they want to go further, but they don't want to feel like an alien in going further, and they want to sort of try to reintegrate some of their humanness, if you will. This is not something that you see much. Whoops. This is not something that you see much in the East. You see this in the East. You see this in America, for the most part, which I think is probably just one of those cultural things. Now, when people go to location 4, sometimes it's such an alien experience for them that they choose to pull themselves back out of it, and they choose to go to earlier locations. I call those people fluid 4s, meaning that they've touched a location, they could probably get back to that location if they want to, but they're not choosing to stay in that location. They're choosing to find a more optimum location. They can probably move around. And so when you hear me use the word fluid 4 or fluid 5, that's what I'm referring to. So here, this path of humanity, they might also become fluid. Now, it's in the reports from people, much, much harder to get back from 5 to 4, 3, 2. Almost nobody goes back to 1. It's comparatively easier to get from 4 to 3 or to 2. But basically, the further you go, the harder it is to get back across that cusp to 4 and 3 and 2. So, for instance, somebody might be able to, once they're back from 5, they might be able to switch between location 2 and 3 in a matter of minutes, but it might take them months to get from 5 to 4, or from 4 back to 5, as an example. Things get strange in these later locations. Like, you start getting lots of reports of psychic activity and psi and stuff like that in locations 5 through 9, especially locations 6 through 9, which seem to be a discrete chunk, sort of like locations 1 through 4 seem to be a discrete chunk. And by the time someone's at the end of 9, they're basically saying this: it feels like it's just the universe looking out my eyes, when asked what their experience of the world is. Now, the reality is they'll say that at location 8, they'll say that at location 7. So you have to be a little bit careful with these types of self-reports. At each of these locations, when you're so far down the continuum, when so much of your individualized sense of self has fallen away, you really think it's all gone. It's very, very easy to think, no, there's nothing left. It's totally gone. And then something happens, and this huge chunk that you were completely blind to falls away, and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? Right? And you have a transition to the next one, 8 or 9 or whatever it is. But this subjective experience remains relatively the same in terms of how they report it, which is really interesting. Also, these transitions can be dramatic and even potentially dangerous. One of the reasons that I haven't talked a lot about location 5 and later is because those transitions can be, I think, quite dangerous. And so there are lots of, basically, you do not want to be isolated and alone and having these types of transitions. They seem to get to very low levels of the nervous system that are binding together your senses, that are really doing sort of core life support functions that were probably bound together where in our, if you think about the narrative sense of self, the traditional sense of self, probably kicking in around age 3, it's had a lot of years to wrap itself up in a lot of processes, right? And so as that gets undone, it's gluing a bunch of stuff together that still needs to be glued together and still needs to function somehow. So there are all kinds of reports of people passing out, even passing out for extended periods of time, even passing out for extended periods of time that were life-threatening, and in some cases people almost lost their lives. Of course, we'll never know who did lose their lives because they can't report data for us. But I do have reports of people who almost did lose their life because they were living alone, and finally they had and they'd missed enough appointments or they'd missed enough work or something that people came looking for them, and they were found passed out on their floor or whatever, and then taken to the hospital and saved. And so there's kind of a glitch that happens between these locations, especially 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and so on, where it's like those chunks that fall away that are so deep, they're so intricately bound up with sort of your life support functions. Sometimes it's a few milliseconds and it's a quick glitch and the brain just reorganizes itself and people don't notice anything. But if you get the unlucky version of that and wind up passed out on your floor for weeks and you don't have anybody looking for you, that's not going to turn out well for you. So I think pursuing some of these later locations can actually be a bit dangerous and is probably not something that's advisable to do in isolation unless you're within a tradition that's really good at monitoring you or that has a really, really has it down sort of in how to get there safely. Okay, so how does it happen? There's basically just a few ways, a few clusters of ways that it happens. First of all is by effort, purposeful effort, right? So if you can't read this, it basically says, be happy, damn it. It's just this guy, and he's like, be happy, right? And so a lot of people get there from meditation or just sort of from trying, but I actually don't think that that's the majority of people. I think the majority of people have what I like to think of as a self-objectifying event. And generally speaking, I bet you, and we don't know yet because we haven't done general population surveys of this, because you can't just call people up and ask them if they have PNSE. It's going to have to reach a certain level of awareness before you can do general population surveys. But I suspect that most people reach PNSE through suicidal depression. And so that's a good example of a self-objectifying event. Like, you really have to objectify yourself in your head to want to kill yourself, right? I mean, you're not operating from within yourself to kill yourself. Like, you've objectified Jeffrey, and Jeffrey's got to go, right? And so some sort of self-objectifying event, whether it's an illness or whatever, could do it as well. And then there's just mysteries. There's just some things that we just don't really know. The caption here is Troy can now see that he's out of the normal flow of things, and he's the only one that doesn't have a funny hat. This one was, in the morning, things just started to slip away from Corley, which I think is another. I love this guy's comics. He's great. Okay, so let me talk about the experiments that we did. So the second part of the study, the second phase, wasn't going around and talking to 1,000 people or whatever that had PNSE or collecting data from them in various ways. And some people we interviewed, some people just filled out a bunch of measures, some people we did physiological stuff on, some people we did combinations of all of that stuff. And so we had about 1,200 or so people in the initial sample that did one or more of those things. And since then, I'd say we're probably up to about 2,500. I did so many, I don't count them anymore. So eventually, we realized that the real limit on our knowledge of this phenomenon was that we weren't able to measure things pre and post. Right, I was going and I was sitting down in people's living rooms or whatever, and I was listening to them for hours at a time until they threw me out. But and I was saying to them, well, who were you beforehand? And, like they could tell me accurately. I mean, I knew that they couldn't tell me accurately. I especially know now that I experienced PNSE that I couldn't tell you accurately who I was beforehand. But I got the sense just from, sitting with enough of them that pre-data was just crap, frankly. That I just couldn't hardly, I mean, you could believe the broad strokes, okay, you were depressed beforehand or, whatever. But in terms of meaningful details, it just wasn't there. So we figured we had to find a way to be able to collect data on who someone was before and then who someone was after in order to start to meaningfully get at this phenomenon, in order to get, good neuroscience efforts behind it and other physiological measuring and stuff like that. And so that's what we did. And we wound up starting basically the world's largest crowdsourced, crowd-funded PNSE experiment, which has had probably over $1 million in support at this point, and has literally basically just opened the doors to the public. Said if you want to try this experiment, if you want to try our protocol, you're welcome to. You know, we've charged various amounts over time. We basically charge however much it takes to keep the dropout rate somewhere between 70 and 80% in the course, right? So we don't like more than 20 or 30% of people to drop out of a course because there's groups and it affects the small group structures and stuff like that. And we learned one of the most important things that we can do to control group structures and people not dropping out is to charge enough that it hurts their wallet if they want to drop out. And so, frankly, that's been the core of the pricing around this experiment for a very long time. And I can tell you at exactly what price level, exactly when people drop out, which is kind of, in a way, sad. I think, you know, it would be sort of cool if people were just like, no, this is just an amazing opportunity, like I am totally in. But no, sadly, they have to think, how much money am I losing? Okay, I'll keep doing it.
What is that number?
Right now, it's somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000, depending upon. Okay, so these are some questions that we sort of set out to address here. So I'm just going to read them to you because they may be hard to read from the back there. Can a short, intense meditation and positive psychology program be beneficial for most people who take it? Can it assist people with the transition to ongoing non-symbolic experience? Can it assist people with the transition across a range of locations, or will they just sort of land in one spot? Is there a significant psychological difference between people who are successful with such a program? Are some people more disposed to be successful than others? And can we find location-specific differences? In other words, using standard psychological data, do things sort of cluster in the data around our locations, like they should, right? If somebody says, I'm happier in location 3 than I was in location 1 than I was when I was normal, we ought to be able to see that. So the structure of the course actually comes from a question that was asked to those first 1,200 people. And on their intake form, one of the things that we asked them was, what worked for you? And we went through and we sorted that. And it turns out there weren't actually that many things that worked for people. There were a relatively small number of meditation practices, for the most part, that worked for them. And we had to work hard to mitigate some of those meditation practices threw people into very negative emotional states and stuff like that. So we had to do some surgery to try to figure out how to not throw people into dark night of the soul experiences and stuff like that, and still use these, because that's, of course, not ethical within a research environment. But that's essentially what constituted the course. We took what was a simple question to people who had already been successful at this, and then we essentially operationalized it with a research protocol. So here's how it breaks down. I think probably you've read the slide by now. But mostly in the first half, we're basically trying to raise their psychological baseline and mitigate dark nights. It's not actually designed to sort of transition you in the first 6 weeks, although roughly 30% of people do transition in the first 6 weeks, just from some of the methods that we stick in there for that. Then there's a break in the middle couple of weeks, and that break is there for 2 reasons. One, sometimes people need to catch up. They fall behind, so they can use that to catch up if they want. Second, it's a good place to sort of practice, if you haven't fallen behind, what's going to work for you, what's not going to work for you, that kind of thing from the first set of weeks. And then it's also a week period where people tend to dip in their well-being. So oftentimes what we'll see is in this first half of the course, well-being will go up, 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 but then it'll start to dip, and it seems to dip right around this period for a very small number of people in each program. And so it also gives those people an opportunity to just stop doing the practices. And to hit the positive psychology exercises really hard to sort of recover their psychological happiness baseline. People don't talk about, like I started the course at, 5, and now this dip has put me back to 2 or something, down to 2. People say, I started the course at 5, I went up to 8, now I'm down to 6. I'm a little worried that it's going to be back down to 5, that kind of thing, right? And so we're not like cratering people's well-being in the middle of the course or something. And then the second half really gets to those methods that came from the early research. So this is where we're at currently with the data. This is about 11 cohorts of data through 2018, essentially. And you can see that there's, more people in location 1 than 2, more people in 3 than 4, and a relatively small handful in 5. These are people who didn't report any experience at all of non-symbolic experience. And then this is temporary, people that had a temporary experience of it. And you can see the totals. Right now we're at about 70% of people transitioning, and our database is about 454 people. And we estimate our dropout rate is right around 30%. You can calculate that in different ways, like, did they fill out the pre-measures? Did they make it through the first week? There's different, you can move that number around. But ballpark is that it's about 30%. So in short, we have a couple of answers, right? One is, can a short, intense meditation and positive psychology program assist people with the transition? Yeah. And do they land across a range of locations? Yeah, they sure seem to, don't they? So these are people who, for the most part, as far as we know, weren't in PNSE prior to the course and where they're landing. And you can see that they're exiting the course across quite a range of the spectrum. And even that it's falling just sort of like you'd expect it to fall, just in terms of how hard different locations are to reach and stuff like that. So we gave them all kinds of academic measures. And a lot of this data I'm just going to let you look at in the background, but I'm going to orient you to the columns. So this is the number of people who took something. Sometimes you'll notice it dips 1 or 2 or something because maybe we had to throw out somebody's score, it didn't seem right, or there's just something that didn't seem right about it. This was their pre-measure score, so before the course. This was after the course. That's the difference. That's the percent of difference. And this is how statistically significant it is. It's ridiculously statistically significant. It's way more than that even. And so, this bottom line is people get a heck of a lot happier. If you're a psychologist and you're in this room and you're looking at these measures, which are all basically gold standard measures from psychology, these are sort of astonishing moves to have in 4 months of people's lives with an online meditation course that's basically a video-delivered online meditation course. These would be astonishing to see in therapy, or astonishing to see from just about anything else. People gasp sometimes when I put up our statistics at psychology conferences and stuff, just because the numbers are so huge. Here's emotional ones, so you can see depression and positive and negative affect. You think of affect as emotion, basically. I like the loneliness one. Look at how far loneliness drops. 47% drop in loneliness. That's kind of amazing, right? Huge drops in anxiety and stress. Again, all very significant. So huge, huge differences going on just from people taking this. Then here's PNSE or ONE type measures. So the NETI is a non-duality measure. This is the one that Maharishi's TM organization, they have one of the largest research efforts into all of this, and so we use their measure because it's been given to so many people in their world. So that's what the MUMX is. And then the M scale is the default measure of mysticism in the academy. It's Ralph Hood's scale. Comes out of Stace's work in the late 60s. And so pretty much these are the leading measures, if you will, that can sort of give us a snapshot of PNSE in one. And again, you see pretty significant movements across these. And then meaning, one thing that better change for you is you better not be having an existential crisis if you transition into PNSE, or you probably haven't transitioned into PNSE, right? So we better see some changes in meaning. You want search to go down, and you want presence to go up. Search is like that discontentment. So you want that discontentment to fall. You don't want to be like seeking after meaning. You want your seeking of meaning to be going down. Personality, this is a huge one. Neuroticism, a 31% drop in neuroticism. If you know anything about personality theory, you know that personalities are supposed to be durable across lifetime. You're not supposed to have these wild swings in your personality traits. And so to have a 31% drop in a major personality trait like neuroticism from a 4-month online course is just astonishing. It's an astonishing finding, frankly. And you can see how some of the other ones moved. Openness, not much there on openness. Then some miscellaneous stuff. I always thought there would be a bigger move on gratitude, but actually, that goes to beliefs about this in the public that are not necessarily true when you're actually doing research on this, right? And so people often stay smokers, they stay drinkers. If they're using drugs, they stay on drugs. Even if they're like heavily drinking, they'll often stay an alcoholic after the transition to PNSE. And there's some very famous ones out there, even. And so one of those things, that people are always trying to sell PNSE as sort of this panacea that just transforms you into some saintly person or whatever. And so one of the things that you expect to see as a result of that, right, is gratitude going through the roof. Oh, I should feel very grateful and, be super loving towards everyone. Well, if you look back at the compassionate love score, it was low too in terms of its percentage. So is gratitude, right? But you can see some other effects on relationships relationships and a sense of accomplishment, and flow, life flow versus task flow. So task flow is like in the moment, you know, you're like playing sports or something. That would be task flow. Life flow is like, how'd your day go? How much flow do you think you had in your day? That kind of thing. And then a little bit of health there. I left the health off the other ones I noticed just before this accidentally. Okay, so here's another one. There's a short, intense meditation and positive psychology program, psychologically beneficial for most people to take it. Heck yeah, look at those numbers. I mean, it's like astonishingly psychologically beneficial. You'd sort of be insane not to do it. Well, what about the difference between people who finished with a report of ongoing non-symbolic experience versus people who finished and either had temporary or no experience of non-symbolic experience? What do the numbers look like for them? So this over here is the people who transitioned, and this over here are the people who reported no or temporary. And N is the number of people again. Pre is the before score. Post is the after score. Diff is the difference. That's the percent of difference. I didn't have enough space to put a bunch of asterisks, and so that means 5 asterisks as an example. So it'd be like that degree of significance. And so you can sort of figure out the same thing over here. And then this is the difference ultimately between these two. Right? So it simply means that these people are basically 20% above these people's ending score. And then you can see also the degree of significance in the difference between the two groups. One of the things that we wanted to know is, do some people seem predisposed to this? You know, is there like, you know, were your entry scores different if you transitioned versus if you didn't transition? Not your post scores, but your entry scores. Were they fundamentally different? Is it possible that some people are just kind of made for this, and maybe other people aren't made for this? And there's some interesting data on this. So if I change this to, it's the same slide, but different things are highlighted. Look at the post scores. So these are this is what's done, right? This is what they're filling out at the end of the program for the people who are not in non-symbolic experience. This is what they're filling out at the end of the program, at the beginning of the program for the people that are in non-symbolic experience. People are finishing usually at or around the level that these people started. So these people's ending score is basically where these people started. It sure looks like there's a big difference between the people that have this transition and don't on these various psychological measures. And you'll see that across all of these. So here's the emotion scores, and you can see, even though this is 60%, right, 60% change here, 22% change here, and some of these might be very similar. So, you know, 16% and 13%, those sound pretty close to each other, but there's actually a 16% difference between these two groups if you look at where they ended up in terms of their exit score. Not just how much they moved as an individual group during the program, but looking across the two groups and comparing the two groups instead of comparing within a group. So big changes, and again, you're going to see this phenomena all the way along. So the post scores here are roughly the same as the pre-scores over here. It's true for emotion. It's true pretty much across the board. In fact, I've just gone ahead and highlighted those columns for you, in addition to the percent of difference columns for these. And you can see there's big differences here. So these guys ended an 81 score, for instance, for the MNETI, and these guys ended a 61. I mean, that's a night and day difference on a measure like that. So big changes. Everything that we saw, basically, in terms of what people were representing from their subjective experience that led us to say, you're in location 1 or you're in location 2 or whatever, it's basically up here. So we were able to use these sort of gold standard measures and actually find correlations from people's subjective first-hand self-report data. Meaning, same thing. Huge differences in meaning between the groups, especially when you look at, you know, search and then how much search drops and where sort of they wind up. Personality, same difference. Huge changes in personality in the one group versus still some changes, you know, for sure, but a 40% drop in neuroticism for people in ongoing non-symbolic experience versus a 16% drop just from the benefits of meditation or something, whatever it was that produced that in the rest of the population. That's a huge difference. That's just a monstrous difference. Same thing, gratitude, relationships, life flow, all of that. You can see basically the same trends. And so answer, is there a significant psychological difference between individuals individuals who transition to 1 or PNSE during such a course, there's tons. There's like a massive difference. We didn't put these in the slides. We're not done computing these two yet. But you can just see this is how much more the people in 1 are than the people that aren't in 1, essentially. These are, I mean, huge differences. 74% of the time happy if you're in 1, regardless of where you're at in 1, versus 53% if you're not on the far side of the course. And that was already after they were made a lot happier. The people that weren't in 1 were already made a lot happier by going through the course in the first place. Some people are some people more disposed to be? Well, you saw it all the way through here, right? So if we go back, this column, there's tons of statistical significance. Again, and again, and again, and again, and again. It's just there non-stop. So there seems to be sort of a huge difference between these two groups of people and the ones who are successful at transitioning to ongoing non-symbolic experience and the ones that aren't. Well, what about locations? Okay, fine. So this is new data for us today. What about locations? Can we see changes over the different locations that someone's in? Now, I want to caution you about one thing, and that is, remember, location 4 and above, unless you sort of take the other track, the return to human track to some degree, but location 4, that path of freedom track past location 4, it feels really alien. And one of the things that we're increasingly seeing and suspecting in the data is that our psychological measures that are meant for normal people, which are basically what we're giving these folks, right? Our gold standard psychological measures that are meant for normal people, they are not meant for this population of people that are in location 4 and beyond location 4. And those people, these questions make no sense to them. They don't show up in any sort of way that's that helpful for us on these measures so far. So here's what it looks like. Here's the happiness measure, one of the default happiness measures in the Academy. And you can see that's not in non-symbolic experience. Then it's a little higher if it's temporary, higher if it's in location 1, higher if it's in location 2, higher if it's in location 3, and then in this case, higher if it's in location 4 and 5. But I didn't bold these because I think for the most part you could ignore them. There's very few samples in there. Most of these measures are not really matched up very well with that population. But you can see, if you go across these, the same trend again and again and again and again. So there's this very clear progression. Remember what subjects insisted. When I was in location 1 and then I transitioned into location 2, location 2 has a lot more well-being for me than location 1 had. Well, there it is, in black and white with gold standard psychological measures, not with just some self-report off the cuff from somebody sitting in their living room. Same thing with emotion. These are, again, the significance numbers. I didn't really have enough space to stick them all on the slide. Some I did down here like this, but some I did up there like that. But if you look across, it's the same story again and again and again and again and again and again and again. Same with ongoing non-symbolic experience and those measures. Same with meaning. Personality. There's that neuroticism score. Look at that sucker fall by the time you reach location 3. And even some data, but again, I don't buy into the data past 3 really at this point. I mean, it's just a huge, huge difference. And then various miscellaneous scores, gratitude and stuff like that. So our final question was, can we find these location-specific differences in pre-post analysis using this data? And we very clearly see them. They're just there in spades, basically. It's incredible. All right, so do the effects last? Well, we just did an alumni follow-up. Excuse me. One of the things that is a bit of an issue with transitioning people to persistent non-symbolic experience is that it makes them a lot less helpful as research subjects. If you say to them, hey, I've got another 5 hours of psychology measures for you to fill out, they're like, great, click. So consequently, it becomes really, really hard to talk them into filling out their exit measures. A lot of it, when we talk about a 30% dropout rate, a lot of that's not a dropout rate. A lot of that is just people choosing not to fill out their exit measures. And so, you know, we can't force them to, and we call them basically a successful participant only if we've gotten pre and post data from them. But many people make it through the course and then just don't fill out their exit measures, no matter how much we beg them to. And many people, when they do fill out their exit measures, complain the whole time, and basically send us feedback like these measures have nothing to do with how I experience the world or consciousness or whatever right now. And so there's a real mismatch between these standard psychological measures for sort of normal human consciousness and what these people are experiencing. So we did manage to get recently 142 people from the alumni community to actually do another 10 hours or something, a lot of data collection for us. And this is the way it broke down. Now, we actually asked these differently at the end of the course than we asked them in the alumni, so you sort of got to lump these two together, and they wind up being pretty much the same. But up here, notice that there's an interesting progression that sort of seems to be happening. So this is from the Alumni Survey, and these were the numbers that you saw earlier in the presentation. And so earlier in the presentation, when people had just landed, they were really sort of, you know, falling in a certain pattern. Lots of location 1s, then not as many 2s, not as many 3s, and so on and so forth. Whereas now it seems like there's sort of a shift happening, and there's a lot more people that are sort of at these higher locations than were at these earlier locations. I think in the entire sample of like 500 people or whatever, we have like maybe 9 people. Ari's in the back of the room. He does a lot of the statistics for us. I think maybe we had like 9 people or something like that that reported more than location 4. And now, just in the alumni survey, we had 16 people that reported that, which is kind of amazing. And same thing, we had a relatively small number of people in location 4. Same thing, you know, bunch. So what looks like is happening is that there's deepening and there's transitioning happening, and that's basically what you see happen after the transition to PNSE. It's almost like there is this process that is taking place in all of us all of the time, and it's like a conditioning process. It's, if you ever heard of Pavlov and the dog, and you know, you ring the bell and the dog salivates and sort of all of that, well, that's basically working in all of us all the time. We're all constantly being conditioned to stuff nonstop, and it's a question of what's being associated with that conditioning. For most of these people's lives, their individualized sense of self was sort of intricately woven into that conditioning, and that's not the case anymore. Now that individual sense of self is weak or gone, and there's a whole different way of experiencing the world, different type of experience, different type of consciousness, whatever word you prefer, that's sort of being weaved into their conditioning process from that point forward. And so as triggers, as psychological triggers hit their nervous system, and they have things rise up in them, previous conditioned responses, part of what it used to grab onto and recondition and reinforce is just gone. It's not there to grab onto anymore. And so you have these fundamental changes taking place over time within their psychology, which is one of the reasons why when someone transitions to PNSE right away, unless it was a really dramatic transition, like a hugely psychologically significant event for them, like maybe they were suicidally depressed and now they're not, you know, now they're really in location 3, they land in 3 or something, right? I mean, except for outliers like that, for most people, they seem normal to the people that are around them still. They still seem like the person that their friends and their coworkers and their family and whatever else had always known. And part of it is because it takes time for this deconditioning process to slowly unwind a lot of those old patterns and a lot of those own habits and whatnot. And so there's a lot of deconditioning. There's 2- and 7-year cycles that seem to be involved with that. And we think of it as sort of deepening, and someone can deepen within a location if they want to, or they can deepen across locations. So you can go further on the continuum, or you can go further into location 2, is a way to think about it. Traditionally, oftentimes, what would happen is people would land in location 2, say, and they would just decondition and try to root themselves as deeply in location 2 as they possibly could. You get the whole Science and Non-Duality conference here and stuff, sort of full of these types of people. Now what's often happening is that they're going further. instead of having sort of a more limited view of, oh, this is what it means to be non-dual or whatever their thing is, right? And they go deeper. Now they're starting to say, wait a minute, there's this whole other vista out there. I think I'll decondition this way and not just decondition sort of this way. And so there's all sorts of changes that are happening in this community. And it's really interesting. It's reduced a lot of the dogmatism. When I first started doing this, these teachers used to fight with each other like cats and dogs. And now they don't nearly as much. We did this thing a couple of years ago where we brought a bunch of the teachers up from SAND and Rick from Bat Gap, if you're familiar with that podcast. And in that auditorium behind you over there, we shot this one big event with like all of these teachers having an exchange with each other. And I was sitting around there thinking, a lot of these people are my research subjects. There's no way they would be having this cordial exchange if it was 10 years earlier. You know, they would have been at each other's dogmatic throats in many cases. And so there's a profound sort of change that's happening here as these things these things become more well known and more widely accepted, and it's, you know, that there isn't a one right way or whatever. Okay, so here's what's next for us. We're working to transition. We're basically done with the experiment with the Finder's course, so we're trying to figure out what to do with that. We think we'll probably transition it to a public course that people can keep using. We're going to continue to mine the FC data. So we hope to be able to create maybe a newer, shorter protocol for use in experimentation. We'd like to get a method. One of the most important findings is that if you can figure out what method to use, you can transition very rapidly. So it shouldn't take you probably more than a week for the average person to transition to PNSE, and that might sound crazy, given you 10,000 lifetime stories and all the things from different religions or whatever. But what we see again and again and again in the data, all the Finder's Course does, the Finder's Course name comes from the fact that the only thing it's trying to do is help you find the method that works for you out of all of the ones that were reported by the 1,200 people initially. Right? So we basically can bat, you know, 70 or 80% with that collection of methods, and it's just a question of figuring out which one's right for you, primarily, right? So it's just a matching thing. We're standing on the top of millennia of people having worked on this problem. There's all kinds of awesome techniques and tools and stuff out there. It's just a question of which one fits you, and which ones are good and which ones aren't so good. So we'd like to get a measure where we could just give you a survey and tell you what you should try. We'd like to get a measure that can tell people what location they're in, rather than us having to do that with interviews. We've got a lot more data mining than that to do. And then we're also working, as you can tell from our alumni project, we're also working on, now we think that the real need, because it used to be, I used to think it was hard to transition to PNSE. Now I realize it's easy to transition to PNSE. Transitioning to PNSE is not the hard thing that people have made it out to be. The hard thing is what's next, what's after PNSE, which is how do you integrate it into your life? How do you, how do you talk to your spouse about it? What do and don't you say to your kids, right? How do you take this impetus to change your career, and should you change your career? Or exactly what period of time should you wait before you make a major decision like that? Because there's a cycle running in the background that you don't know anything about from your current lived experience. There's just so many pieces of knowledge like that to help people actually integrate into PNSE, and there's basically nothing, very little has ever been written or talked about in that vein, because everybody's spent all their time trying to get people there. But so we think a lot more people are going to be getting there, and now the problem is ultimately the same problem that we have in our alumni community, which is like, how do we tell people once they're there? I thought we could just turn them loose to the spiritual teacher community out there, and that they'd be fine, but that turned out to be disastrous. And simply because, if you imagine like you land in location 4, right, and you see someone on YouTube and you think, oh, that's a person who I'm going to go listen to, but it turns out they believe in location 3 as being the end of all, location 3 is the great place that is enlightenment, right? And you come to them and you say, oh, I don't have emotions or a sense of agency or whatever, and they're like, oh my God, something's gone really wrong with you, right? And now you're like, oh my God, something's gone really wrong with me. And so it's just sort of a breadth of knowledge around this area that seems to be lacking in the public support sense, and there doesn't seem to be a way to really sort of sort the teachers and stuff like that. So anyway, we think this is a huge area that we've got to work on, and we've been working on it for a while, and we're still at it. All right, thanks.